The following episode may not be so interesting for people outside of the Balkan region. And in G-Spodcast, there will be a lot of content regarding the Balkans, so stay tuned for that. But it could be interesting for people interested in history, let's say, or even those interested in the current politics of the region. My guest today is Professor Ivan Dinev from the University of Cincinnati. With him, we discussed a subject that many people in the West don't know nothing about, and that's mainly the troubles that the Republic of North Macedonia have on its European Union ascendancy path. The trouble with Macedonian historiography, the not-so-hidden role of Hungary and Serbia in the region on the Western Balkans, and a lot more. Professor Dinev's main area of interest are international relations and international security and cooperation. Unfortunately, we did not have the time to cover the current geopolitical situation, but there is always a next time. I believe we had a wonderful chat, very honest and without gloves. I believe more conversation like this are needed and more awareness and understanding to the region of Western Balkans should be given. And now what follows is the conversation itself. All right, welcome to G-Spodcast, Professor Dinev, straight from Cincinnati, Ohio. How are you? How are you feeling today?
Thank you very much. I am feeling actually very well, and I look forward to our conversation with you, Georgi, and with your. Hopefully, that will be an interesting something interesting for your viewers.
Now let's start like that. We had an understanding we're going to talk about a lot about Macedonia, a subject that you are really invested in. What can you tell me? Can you describe that dispute between the Bulgarian side and the North Macedonian side to a person who doesn't know anything about it? And as a follow-up question to this, we know that North Macedonia had a veto from Greece not a long time ago. Then Bulgaria stopped their Euro accession path. Do you see any similarities there, and what are the differences?
Okay, so this is a really good question. And quite understandably, most people don't follow politics of small nations. And this is a really, really small nation. North Macedonia today is about 1.8 million people. So it could be pretty much a borough of London or a bit of like a mid-size British city or a mid-size North American city, like Cincinnati, Ohio. Actually, the Cincinnati metro area is larger than the city of Cincinnati, than the entire population of the country of North Macedonia. So what is it about? I mean, the truth is that for the most part, I think the situation there, the occurrence of these so-called vetoes, one from Greece and one from allegedly from Bulgaria, is a product of clashing narratives, what I would call it, conflicting narratives, and some of those narratives were generated and created fairly late in the game, somewhere around, let's say, mid 20th century in the case of North Macedonia. And they clashed with the narratives about nations, identity, nation building, in general, how these nations in this part of the world came into being. And they collided inadvertently over the heritage that this country has with its neighbors, mostly with Greece, on the antiquity and the connection that exists between the ancient population and the present-day population, but also with Bulgaria. And in particular with Bulgaria, the dispute refers to a more recent period, particularly the Middle Ages as a historical heritage of the Middle Ages, but mostly also the patterns of nation building that occurred in late 19th and early 20th century. So as a result of these conflicting narratives, the disputes, and that's why this is the similarity of the disputes. Of course, there is a very specificity. In the case of Greece, the Greeks, what they wanted to do is they wanted to have a distinction, the separation of the two narratives. So the Macedonian narrative had to accept that certain things do not belong to the North Macedonian, I should say, that the narrative of North Macedonia does not belong to their narrative, but instead it is a part of the ancient Greek heritage. That in and of itself can be, or Hellenic, I should say, heritage. That in and of itself is a matter of a long and lengthy philosophical conversation. And the whole matter of just dividing up heritage can be a little bit problematic, because heritage cannot and should not only be divided, but also shared. But of course, the idea of having national monopoly, especially of a relatively young national idea over antiquity, over the heritage of Alexander the Great, is ridiculous. Of course, his heritage is far greater and should be shared. With the case of Bulgaria, it is actually more painful because a narrative was created in probably around the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s by people who, let's be honest, at that time were not the greatest and the brightest minds of history, of social science, of modern intellectual accomplishments, who basically created this a reflection that Macedonian national idea and identity existed at the same time, or emerged at the same time as, in parallel to, the national ideas and identities of its neighbors, Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia, and in a way Albania as well. Well, that is actually not accurate. And so the whole dispute became about what kind of heritage is that. And again, here the Bulgarians said something different. They said, okay, we're not trying to separate the heritage, but instead we're trying to share it, In other words, something that belongs to both of us. And the Macedonians said, no, we have the right of our national story. In our national story, we have the right of a monopoly over this heritage, and so in that way, the dispute between Greece is different. In Greece, Greeks were the ones who demanded the separation of the heritage. And the Macedonians were, no, we shouldn't give it up, and oftentimes they erroneously see that also as a dispute with Bulgaria, where Bulgarians demand the separation. No, Bulgarians actually demand the opposite, sharing, and Macedonians demand monopoly. And oftentimes when they argue with the same heroes that you're trying to share us, they're more important to us than to you. Hence, we have a greater right to claim legitimacy over them rather than you, which again is inaccurate. All of this does not fit the European idea. The European idea is that, of course, this heritage belongs to everybody who lives in the region, no matter when they came, who their great-grandfathers were, or how they felt. But at the same time, you have to understand that nobody has the monopoly. Everybody has the responsibility to share it, and to share it in a way that kind of builds bridges. So we have now a situation where in the early 1990s, Bulgarians had a hard time of accepting the existence of the Macedonian nation, separate Macedonian language, identity, etc. Over the course of the years, Bulgarian government, most of common sense Bulgarians have accepted the differences. But at the same time, the major follow-up question that has arisen these days is whether a separate group of nations exists that call themselves Macedonian Bulgarians or Macedonian Bulgarians. And we're seeing clearly now that many circles in North Macedonia, particularly the ruling party, has a problem of accepting this population which originates from these regions, which for many generations have defined themselves either as Bulgarians or Macedonian Bulgarians or Bulgarians from Macedonia. And it has also the tendency to deny, to belittle, diminish, modify, twist around their very existence. This actually hits in the EU fundamentals. That's why Bulgarians actually agreed in the latest iteration of this dispute in 22 with the government of North Macedonia, that since North Macedonia by design is a multinational state, which consists of one large group of peoples and a number of list of smaller groups of people, what I call them, which is minorities basically, but they use a different language, which is called groups of people. And then one of those that will be added to the list are going to be the Bulgarians, implying that these were Macedonian Bulgarians. Of course, there is still not consensus over whether that should happen. There's, of course, other issues, excuses, and so that is an ongoing dispute. Now, of course, this is the precondition for them to open actual negotiations into the EU, and because they refuse to amend the constitution at this point, for a variety of reasons that we can talk separately, because of that, they're actually stuck and they are not making any progress in the negotiations toward EU membership. I hope that kind of clarifies in a nutshell.
That clarifies it perfectly. Yes. I just wanted to ask you about the problem that North Macedonia had with Greece, because a lot of people say it's just about the changing of the name, but the root of the problem was a historical problem. Who is the real Macedonians and who are the ancestors too? Basically, it's a very big question. We know in the historiography There is a lot of different opinions about that subject, but they were definitely not Slavic. They were definitely not Slavic, and this is very true. But both in the conflict with the political conflict with Greece and the political conflict with Bulgaria, we have a problem with the Macedonian historiography, and I have a big problem as a historian, a person who reads a lot of books about that history of the region and history of internal Macedonian revolutionary organization. I think a lot of people say from Macedonian side that the problem is between those conflicting narratives between Bulgarian historical tale and Macedonian historical tale. I think that the Macedonian historiography have a problem with the world historiography. I'm living in London. I'm reading R.J. Crampton, Stephen Runciman, Stefan Tropst, which is a German historian. He writes about the Macedonian Revolutionary Organization. And most of the things, at least 95% of the things that are in the Bulgarian historical books are proven, and you can read the same things here in the Oxford educated historians. How would you comment that? How do we counter that? It's like they're living we had that discussion before the podcast of some form of a cognitive dissonance where all of the world is agreeing on one thing and they're just saying or writing the other and falsifying documents, which is even worse.
So, yes, this is a big problem. And so the problem that we have is to explain why that actually matters through the EU integration process. I completely agree it's a big problem. Not only what we call world historiography, the English language historiography that you mentioned, R.J. Crampton, but also people from the region who have provided intellectual work all around the globe. Most recent work on 19th century Macedonia, Ep3 2014, very clear. Only Turkish and Greek archival documents, not any Bulgarian or any other archival documents used in work. Very clear, very explicit about it. Ivo Banac, again, Croatian scholar out of Professor out of University of Yale, again, very clear about the national question in Yugoslavia book, and so on and so forth. It is mountains of evidence in one direction and virtually no evidence. And that's why I actually said that there were actually a few individuals. We know their names. One of them was this guy Dinev over from Smokvica, from this village in Gevgelija, Smartakalev, Ivanovsky, and a bunch of other individuals who belonged to the communist idea of the 1930s and 40s, and they started actually writing a narrative which basically took all these Bulgarian heroes from the Middle Ages all the way through Imaro and presenting them as Macedonian. So they were not wrong in the sense that these people felt belonging to the region of Macedonia and could have referred themselves also as Macedonian. What they created is this fraudulent forgery that these people had an identity separate from the Bulgarian, namely. Most of them identified either as Macedonian Bulgarians or as Bulgarians. Yes, they loved Macedonia. They identified as Macedonians, just like Dalmatians identified as Dalmatians, but also as Croats. Kosovars living in Kosovo identified as Kosovars, but also as Albanians. Cypriots as Cypriots, but also
similar case with Montenegro too.
Yeah, Montenegro is even a little bit more complicated, but there is this multi-tiered identity, and we've talked about this on other occasions. So this doesn't come to a surprise, and of course they had the love for their region, and it was them who actually in the 1920s started talking first about having an independent state, and before that in the late 19th century started talking about autonomous Macedonia or Macedonia for the Macedonians. So people who had Bulgarian consciousness and identified themselves Bulgarian Macedonian Bulgarians were the ones who actually created the idea of Macedonian first as a political, what we call it, Macedonianness, and then gradually, the left wing of those group of people in the Imaro were in the 1930s started creating separate national identity. Either way, all of this happened in the somewhere between 1930s and 1940s, and all the evidence, or the overwhelming amount of evidence, is pointing in this direction. Not only that, but if you look at the Greek sources, if you look at Serbian sources, where there was basically major clash between these three big nationalisms, the Bulgarian, the Greek, and the Serbian in Macedonia. They're all confirming. I was just listening very recently. There was a Serbian intellectual, Uroš, I forgot his last name, who published a book on that. And he was looking at the Serbian national idea, and the Serbian Chetniks who were active in Macedonia. And he was saying, well, they were clashing with IMRO, who were a Bulgarian organization. A pro-Bulgarian, and who stood for the Bulgarians in Macedonia. So some people call it historical revisionism. And that's when I end up explaining what's the historical dispute, the essence of the historical dispute, which is the implications are far beyond history, but the essence of it is the some people call it historical revisionism. Fellows from sort of East European historical societies here use that label. And other colleagues of mine, when I've talked and showed them some of my discussions with Professor Chepreganov and others on Macedonian TV stations, they said, well, they look at me and say, well, so what you're telling is that they're committing a forgery. Yes, that is a forgery or falsification. And the essence of the problem is that they start with an erroneous assumption that Macedonian national idea and identity started to develop parallel to the Bulgarian, Serbian, or Greek, which was 1930. That was just wrong. And that is the essence of the problem. Yes, I agree.
I guess that's a very small price to pay for their historical emancipation and nation building. I mean, this is how they think. I mean, it's boggling to me. But how can we counter that? I mean, I'm speaking as a Bulgarian here. I'm not pretending. I'm biased in this case, and obviously looking at the sources, they confirm what we believe in and what we read. It's just that how do we counter that? Like, can we counter it with veto and historical commission, or there is more ways we can fix that?
Okay, so that's a good question, especially in the age of nationalism and in the age of the post-Westphalian and Westphalian order, when you have nation states, there is this deeply rooted understanding everybody has the right to write their own history. Well, okay, there's two things that I think. First of all, we need to have an honest and intellectual conversation, which I think is happening. It is happening in a very twisted and perverted way because the other side is either avoiding or is using sort of a propaganda tools at home instead of engaging into a genuine conversation. But, in the end of the day, there's also a process of maturation of the domestic elite, where the domestic political elite has to understand that the longer this conversation drags on and on, the longer we're actually throwing at each other documents, it's the more damaging for their identity. It's not damaging for my identity, for your identity, for the identity of the Bulgarians who live in what we call now Pirin Macedonia, or in the Blagoevgrad regions, or around the globe who have Macedonian roots. Their identity is not being questioned and threatened. It's pretty stable. It's the identity of the people in what we have today, North Macedonia, who firmly believe in something that does not correspond, is not supported by documents, and accept a narrative that, frankly, is not accurate, is not reflecting the historical evidence and the consensus in world historiography. That is actually in and of itself destructive for their own national identity, because then the Macedonian public. And you're not seeing that in the public opinion polls. Oftentimes, public opinion polls are actually reflecting this cognitive dissonance. This is an initial reactions of resistance, because it creates a sense, oh, my identity is threatened, so I'm going to be more Macedonian than I am. But in the background, they're also asking the question, is this true? Is this true that these people that we read about in the textbooks actually identified themselves otherwise? And of course, when you face this cognitive dissonance, your first reaction is, I don't want to read the originals. But then somebody brings them up, whether we create a video, a podcast, something. And it's like, is this really true? I don't believe that. So they become aggressive toward it. That's the second stage of the cognitive dissonance. So denial, aggressiveness. And then after some time, because it's kind of bugging them, So that is affecting their identity. So there has to be a process of maturation, what we call it. They have to go and get mature, the political elites.
And that takes time, definitely. Yeah.
Yes, this is one thing. But the other thing is, yes, we have the EU membership tools, The EU membership tools were not when the Copenhagen criteria, so-called Copenhagen criteria, were created in 1993, we did not even know that Macedonia was literally about a year of independent Macedonia, whether it would exist as an independent Macedonia. And of course, the historical problem, we thought by then that this would be resolved by the time they get a new member. So in other words, they will get the historical facts right, because otherwise, it's damaging to their own national interest and their own national identity. And so when they wrote the Copenhagen criteria, they're very general, And now everybody in Skopje is telling you, and I'd like people, both English-speaking audience in Macedonia, around the globe, and mostly among their diaspora, to understand, well, actually, this historical forgeries, historical misrepresentations, historical revisionism that is being engaged is a part of the Copenhagen criteria. It's not a bilateral dispute. This is the essence of which we have to explain the rest of the world through all possible means and media. It hurts the core foundational principles of the membership criteria. The first criterion, which is the political criterion, it has something that is called democratic governance, democratic rule. Democratic governance and democratic rules means exactly that, revising the textbooks that in a way that they reflect more accurately what happened in the past. I understand, and you, Georgi, will agree that every country has the right to create a narrative that serves best their own interests, and of course, if you even look at the Macedonian movement, the struggle for independent state, which ultimately leads to the creation of an independent national identity, much like in the case of Austria or Norway or Flanders. Well, Flanders is not an independent, but it's Belgian identity and multi-tiered identity. This is a normal process. We don't have a problem with that. We have a problem of how it is explained, And oftentimes I'm being asked also this question, so why is this that they had to have this narrative of denying the Bulgarian roots of many of those individuals from the 19th and 20th century, and actually, frankly, a considerable portion of the population? Why is it that they have to create this fraudulent, inaccurate narrative? And this is really the hardest question, because Austrians don't deny the connection with the German identity that they've had, and they actually use very easily the term, well, we all know that before World War I, before the creation of the modern Austrian state, they were Germans within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not only in Austria, but also in Slovenia, all the way to Romania. They always call them Germans. They don't call them Austrians, Or the Norwegians in the same way. Oftentimes in the early stages, we see that those processes were going parallel with the Danish, Danish crown. The people in Flanders, oftentimes, they were part of the once upon a time Kingdom of the Netherlands. They were part of, subject of wars and so on. But there was this connection. They're not denying this connection. So why was Macedonia denying this connection? And the answer that I have is very simple. Listen. Once you have the people who created the narrative, they were not very smart. Ivan Dinev was one of those people who did that. And I'm sorry to say that, but these are the people who created the narrative. And it's sad. Second, this narrative was created in a totalitarian society, communist Bulgaria, but also communist Yugoslavia. And third,
speaking about the narrative,
communist Yugoslavia had this is something that our viewers have to understand. Communist Yugoslavia had a vested interest in having anti-Bulgarian rhetoric. Their major security concern was that if the population in Macedonia, even though they might have felt different now, had accurate understanding about their past and the connection that exists with Bulgaria, they were worried that under certain circumstances, particularly with the Tito-Stalin clash in the Cold War, potentially, if a conflict erupts between Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, and that conflict was very much likely, or there was a serious concern about that conflict all the way since the creation of Yugoslavia, since the end of World War I, throughout the Cold War, because we know that during the Cold War, two countries shared ideology but had very conflicting. So they were very worried that if Bulgarian army enters, then in Macedonia, Bulgarian army might very well enjoy support, much like it did during the First and, frankly, the Second World War. So it was very important to create a sense of identity in the public that completely, totally denies the existence of this connection with Bulgaria, with the Bulgarian people and the Bulgarian historical narrative, Unfortunately, of course, it served well the Yugoslav interests of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and 80s. But now it actually serves against the EU interests. This is because the EU interest is to bring the peoples together. You can't have a narrative that divides the people. You can't have a narrative that creates a conflict. This is anti-EU. This is against the fundamentals of the EU. This undermines the very process of EU integration. And this is what we need to explain the public. Georgi, yeah, go ahead about historical narratives you wanted to.
No, you said it. You said it very well. I just wanted to mention that the Bulgarian Communist Party plays a very big role in the formation of the Macedonian state. You know about Vasily Ivanovsky and company, and obviously Georgi Dimitrov. But because you ended up on the European Union note there, is there authentic Macedonian policy? Because it looks to me that Macedonia is following some other policy, some other country's agenda, and authentic Macedonian policy for me is to be of the free world, of the West, and part of the European Union. But that's not happening.
We did actually reading of some documents and analysis of the early 20th century of Brailsford, I think was it. He was exactly saying that this was what Macedonian Bulgarians felt like. They were much more anti-Russian than Bulgarians than Principality of Bulgaria, and much more pro-Western and pro sort of Salonika focused, when the idea of having sort of an autonomous and then later independent state. Now, of course, this version of the Macedonian identity and population is very different from 1905. Things have changed a lot in the last 120 years, so to say. And as a result of this change, so I actually, well, of course, we have Europe is an arena where you have this big clashes between the sort of pro-Russian, pro-Chinese stance, which is sort of intended to undermine the West and the Western institutions and the Western tools, the Western security architecture, if you want to put it. And of course, small disputes, whether it's Bulgaria and Macedonia, whether it's Bosnia and Serbia, or the status of Republika Srpska, whether it's Kosovo and Kosovo Albanians versus the Serbs, even Slovenia, Croatia, any of this could be a very useful tool to divide, basically, so these divisions and to undermine the whole integration project, to undermine the whole process of integrating Europe whole and free, what we have. So, yes, but that being said, we have to be very cautious, and I'm against, and we need to be very cautious when we say, oh, it's the Serbs and the Russians that are sitting in their chairs, and every single day they're coming up with conflictual narratives, and they're almost like they're sitting on the sidelines and managing or coaching the conflict between Bulgaria and Macedonia, particularly between the Macedonian government and Bulgaria, because it seems that the Macedonian government these days is waging this war. It's actually a lot of this is homegrown, and it's homegrown because it's when you create a narrative that is exclusive. This is the one thing that in the last 35 years the Macedonian society has created a sense of Macedonism, a Macedonian identity that is exclusive. It is somebody who is Slavic, who potentially claims Asian roots, from antiquity, somehow mixed up with the Slavs. They're still working on getting that mixture, played out. And it is not Bulgarian, Greek, Albanian, Serbian, or anything else. So this is exclusive. We are unique and we're very different from everybody else. Instead of saying, hey, we're actually inclusive, everybody who is part of that story in the region could be Serbs, Bulgarians, Greeks, Romanians, Blacks, you name it, they're all part of us, That would have been much easier to manage and digest, But they chose to go in a different direction, Georgi. And that exclusive narrative has created a sense that, okay, now our exclusivity is being threatened by people from all around the world. It was mostly the Greeks and the Bulgarians because they have the tools, to do that. And because of that, it has become sort of a homegrown nationalist resistance. So I'm more on the camp side to say, hey, this is actually a merger, unholy alliance between this homegrown exclusivity that has led to this anti-European nationalist agenda that says, okay, we got to abandon the treaty with Greece, we got to abandon the treaty with Bulgaria. There's no way we can have good relations with these people. We can do whatever we do. If we need to eat roots, we will eat roots in the wood, but we will fight against our neighbors because all we have is our pride and our national identity, this sense of exclusivity. So it has, of course, merged very successfully with the Serbian and Russian interests. Russian interests, again, long-term are to destabilize the EU because basically EU is the one that is putting sanctions and pressure on Russia. So if you destabilize them, they're not going to be able to make any decisions. So that's long-term interest. They're seeing themselves as an alternative. And the Serbs, of course, have pure historical aspirations, over a large part of the Balkans, the so-called Serbian world, which, again, I'm not an expert on, but have seen and read and understood enough to know that Serbian world expands mostly in Bosnia, parts of Montenegro. Serbian influence is very powerful, bits of Kosovo at least, whatever they can. Of Kosovo is actually the heart and soul of Serbia, the Holy Land, and of course in Macedonia. And this is the weirdest thing, actually. We're seeing that Serbian historians and podcasters and politicians have no problem saying, oh, well, this is an old Serbia and they're all Southern Serbs, and when they say that, of course, somehow Skopje people and celebrate battles where it was clear that Macedonians and the Macedonian elite was against the expansion of Serbian influence in the Balkan Wars and the First World War, and they have no problem going and celebrating them, which is how perverted this nationalism is, and it's to us it's extremely weird, but somehow they were able to create that merger of homegrown nationalism on the one hand and the foreign interest, and I think the purpose they're doing. So Serbs, of course, enjoy their status and their ability to penetrate and expand their influence in North
They even have a
Macedonia.
minister, right?
Right, yeah, and of course everybody, but it's a minister who's born there who says that the only citizenship that he has is Macedonia, but he represents the Serbian community there, So why am I saying all of this? I think there's a bigger plan here on the part of the Macedonian elite and on the part of the security services, the so-called UDBA or whatever, the deep state, their purpose is not so much to show love for Serbia for the sake of the love of Serbia, but their purpose is to show to the Bulgarians, hey, listen, if you don't raise the historical question, if you just leave our narrative alone, if you just play ball, support us you can have exactly the same thing that the Serbs have, We'll go
this is called emotional blackmail.
Yes. So, see, this is what they have it, but the reason why they have it is because they play ball, If you play ball, you will have the same thing. And I've been told many, many times when I go to North Macedonia, you just do what the Serbs do, and you'll be fine. You'll be actually much better positioned than they because you're wealthier, you're in the EU, you have all the tools they do. And that's there. And this is actually pro-Serbian Serbianization policy started particularly after Bulgaria, well, I wouldn't even call it imposed veto, but rather objected to the negotiating framework, the initial version of the German presidency in 2020, which basically delayed the starting of the negotiations. Yes.
Now, yeah, because we don't have a lot of time, Professor, I want to speak to you about other subjects too. And you actually already answered the questions about Serbia and the role in Macedonia that it plays and the Serbian world. But I wanted to ask you about the role of Hungary, because the role of Hungary is very interesting in the Western Balkans specifically. Why is that?
Well, Hungary is, sometimes they call it Trojan horse, Over the course of the years, the position of Viktor Orban has evolved. Like I studied in Hungary 5 years ago at the Central European University. At that time, Viktor Orban was still I think it was the second term of the prime minister.
I also studied in Ep3, right?
Okay, yes. But when I studied there at CEU, he had a very different relationship. He was sort of the pro-Western, pro-democratic leader who was pushing the country for democratization. Over the course of the years, he has embraced this alternative to the EU and has joined this wave of nationalism. conservatism, nationalism, and has put him a lot closer to Russia, because he's facing a lot of pressure from inside the EU. So he is actually trying to leverage that pressure, I think, and hence expand his influence. So it's no secret that, of course, when they see that a conflict of this like this occurs, they're going to play the line of, we want a partnership. Now, what I think has happened is, so they're, of course, trying to fill that void and that vacuum because Bulgaria is putting pressure to change the narrative. He says, okay, I'm going to be the good guy and, love me and I'll love you back. And they said, okay, sure. And so that's why they're using financial tools. But I think there's something else. He looks up at his position and he says, okay, I can negotiate my best position here by aligning with the Serbs and by aligning with the Macedonians. And part of this is also by aligning with the Chinese and the Serbs, and the Russians. Why? Because again, the Chinese, the Russians, the Hungarians and Serbs might have different interests, diverging interests, yet they have one thing in common, which is the sort of the Western liberal order that is created, of which a manifestation is the EU. And their purpose is to offer an alternative. I think what has happened here, again, I don't have a lot of hard evidence, but there's been a high level of negotiation coordination where China looks and says, hey, I want to build this high-speed rail from Salonika to all the way to Budapest. Orban says it's a great opportunity for me because high-speed rail means I can move quickly your commodities inside into the heart of Europe. And so that's why he's building this, what is called now strategic alliance with Serbia, strategic partnership with Macedonia, throwing a lot of money at North Macedonia, throwing a lot of money at their government, and I think some of it is some negotiations going on behind the scenes with Greece as well. So I think there is of course an economic interest behind it, and it's more subservient to the Chinese interests, But if that helps consolidate anti-EU sentiments, whether it be those in Macedonia, North Macedonia, or be those in Serbia, it's also welcome. So again, I think this is actually an alliance of diverging interests, converging interests, but they're different interests. And as much as that is an alliance, that alliance is also somewhat fragile and can fall apart very quickly if the right circumstances are available on the ground. And here I should actually say that Bulgaria clearly sees that as antithetic to its own interests, such an alliance to emerge, even though we know that in Bulgaria, actually, Russian influence is very strong, and that's a major factor that works against Bulgaria being able to articulate and further its own interests. But Bulgaria has a lot of leverage, including leverage over Hungary. Bulgaria was dependent on Hungary to get okay for Schengen. Now all the Schengen decisions are already done. What Bulgaria can do is step up the pressure on Hungary to say, hey, you're buying a lot of Russian gas that goes through Bulgaria because all the pipelines through Ukraine are shut down, the Druzhba pipeline, and the Northern Stream is also shut down. So your only supply of Russian gas is through Bulgaria. So we have tools, I'm not sure why those tools are not used, but again, I'm not a policymaker. I'm just asking questions.
Professor, how do you see the future of the Western Balkans? Give me the worst scenario and the best scenario in your opinion.
Well, I mean, the best scenario, of course.
Let's see the next 10 years.
I'm not extremely optimistic. What I think actually, and the reason why I had a graph that I send you, and I hope you will be able to show it, is showing us two stories, basically, a tale of two stories, The one story is the EU integration story, which basically shows us how Bulgaria and Romania have caught up. Hungary has slowed down, but it has slowed down again because it has somewhat resisted EU and has embraced sort of this fringe ideologies, You have Poland, which has performed extremely well, and you go to the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, it has caught up and it's at the level of Spain and Portugal today. So if the whole idea was EU membership brings convergence, the convergence has actually happened in Central Europe for the most part, and it is happening in Bulgaria and Romania. Romania had a very rapid, accelerated growth, but it's probably going to slow down now because it has issues with public debt and etc. So with all of their ups and downs, and for example, Greece is a story of slow economic growth in the last 20 years, since 2004. And part of the reason they have had a slow growth is because of the financial crisis, etc. Bulgaria has been kind of the laggard always, but all of those countries have converged and have formed a pack, of EU members that are fairly close, with maybe 10, 15, 20% difference in their GDP per capita in purchasing power today. A lot smaller gap than they had 20 years ago. And the poor have moved up, And then you're seeing Serbia and North Macedonia. Now, they have actually diverged from that pack. They were somewhat closer to that pack 20 years ago, and they have diverged. And there's about 30 to 60% gap between their GDP today and that of the Central and Eastern Europe. That gap was not nearly as big 20 years ago. So what has happened is that they have diverged from the rest of the EU. So it's clearly to me the story that EU membership is the one that brings prosperity. The longer you delay EU membership, the more likely you are your economy to diverge from the EU, get poorer, and frankly experience all kind of economic deterioration. So those countries that join the EU first are going to be the ones that are going to be actually getting closer and closer to the EU. Albania, I think, has a real potential to be on that list and to be able to close negotiations by 2028, 2030. There is now an appetite to show, at least for some countries, that convergence can happen, and that EU membership can be a true story. Maybe, hopefully, Montenegro will also be. Problem is that Montenegro is being destabilized from other factors and sources, And then, of course, you have Bosnia, Serbia, you have Kosovo, and, of course, North Macedonia. I'm skeptical that any of those countries can join until 2030 because of all these other stories that exist, And what is going to happen is if in the next 5 years those two become EU members, that could cause, of course, the outcome of the war in Ukraine. Now the things can also influence the change of hearts, In fact, I think Serbian people can realize that they're much better if they bring everybody into the EU, themselves included, and that's going to ultimately solve their national and nationalist problems. The Serbian world can be the best way to do a Serbian world is to get into the EU. Well, of course, that means to solve the problem with Kosovo, accept Kosovo and its existence, settle all relations, but this is going to be difficult. I don't see any of this happening right now, So unless this mentality changes, just like when we talk about Macedonia, if they accept a modification of the historical narrative, which is not only in Macedonia, Bulgaria also has to do some adjustments there. And it's an ongoing process. But if they accept that adjustment, it's going to strengthen their national identity. And it's going to open them the pathway to the EU, which is ultimately the way to provide prosperity and security for their citizens. And it's ultimately the dream of the Macedonian nationalists to unify all parts of Macedonia and Bulgarian nationalists to unify all parts that were left outside of this Bulgarian national idea of the 19th century, So EU is the tool of all nationalisms to do very, very well and get along very well. Problem is, when will these nationalists and their narratives understand that? I don't know if it's going to happen. But ultimately, I am happy that Bulgaria is in that club, and with all of its ups and downs, is actually getting closer and closer integrated into that club, which consolidates its position, its favorable position relative to everyone else in the region, in a turbulent region and in turbulent times.
Thank you very much for this interview, Professor. Let's finish at that. And a big shout out for Corridor 8, by the way. I know you're a guest there quite often.
Yes.
And people who speak Bulgarian, people who can understand Macedonian, tune in, watch that podcast. You can find out a lot of information about the politics between the two countries. Thank you very much again. I wish you a lovely day. Yeah?
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And congratulations to you, your podcast, and your viewers. Best of luck. Thank you.